Rome in the 19th century was a city drenched in contradictions. Pilgrims streamed through its gates, seeking the holy embrace of the eternal city, while politicians, aristocrats, and clerics wrestled for power behind heavy oak doors. At first glance, the convents scattered throughout Rome seemed like sanctuaries of purity and silence, where women devoted their lives to God in cloistered peace. But as history so often teaches us, the walls that promise protection can also conceal unspeakable darkness. In the year 1858, one such convent, the seemingly modest Sant'Ambrogio della Massima, would become the stage for a scandal so sensational, so grotesque, that even its details read more like the pages of a forbidden novel than the records of holy life. Within those walls, whispers of poison and secret burials mixed with the cries of novices coerced into sacred unions. Priests defiled their vows, visions from heaven turned into weapons of seduction, and even the Pope himself found his authority entangled in the mess. It was not merely a tale of sin, it was a theater of survival, betrayal, and the dangerous allure of power disguised as piety. Imagine a convent where nuns claimed to receive divine visions commanding them to commit acts of intimacy. Where rival saints, one condemned, another rising, fought for supremacy in the minds and bodies of young women desperate to serve God. Picture a German princess, corpulent and ailing, stepping through those cloisters in search of refuge, only to find herself the target of slow, deliberate poisoning. And surrounding it all, the shadow of the Roman Inquisition, an institution once feared for its ruthless purges, now called upon to sift truth from hallucination, devotion from deception. This is the story of the Sant'Ambrogio scandal. A labyrinth of lust and faith, ambition and silence, where even the most sacred vows became weapons. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. And so, we begin where all great scandals begin, not with the guilty but with the one who dared to speak. A woman whose very presence, both imposing and vulnerable, would unravel the hidden world inside Sant'Ambrogio. Her name was Princess Katharina von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. Princess Katharina von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen was not the kind of woman one expected to find behind the barred gates of a convent. Twice widowed, childless, and in fragile health, she was nonetheless a figure of immense presence, famously corpulent, sharp-willed, and bound to one of the most prestigious dynasties of southern Germany. In a Europe torn between fading empires and rising nationalism, a woman of her rank might have chosen to retreat into a life of comfortable aristocracy. Instead, Katharina longed for something that seemed, at least from the outside, more exalted, the quiet embrace of a convent life. Her first attempt to enter a convent ended in failure, an early sign that her search for sanctity would not be simple. Yet she remained resolute. With the counsel of Cardinal Karl August von Ryssack, a powerful churchman and family ally, she turned her eyes toward Rome itself. The convent of Sant'Ambrogio seemed the perfect choice, respected, central, and according to Ryssack, a house where the spirit of devotion was strong. For a woman seeking both refuge and transcendence, the decision seemed divinely appointed. But Sant'Ambrogio was no sanctuary. Within 15 months of her arrival, Katharina's body bore the marks of poison, her mind spiraled in terror, and her faith, ironically, became her weapon of escape. By 1859 she was rescued by her cousin, Archbishop Hohenlohe Schillingfürst, a man of influence and a sharp critic of the ultramontane forces in Rome. Katharina was rushed from the convent to the lush safety of his estate at Villa d'Este, her corpulent frame weakened, her breath labored, her very survival precarious. What, the archbishop demanded, had pushed her to flee. Katharina's denunciation was as wild as it was damning. She claimed the convent harbored a cult devoted to a false saint, that confessional seals were broken, that novices were seduced under the guise of heavenly visions, and most chillingly, that someone had tried to kill her with poison. To the ears of skeptics, it may have sounded like the delirium of a sickly woman. But Katharina was no hysteric. She was a princess with a name that commanded attention, and her words carried weight. Her denunciation landed squarely in the lap of the holy tribunal of the Sanctum Officium, the Roman Inquisition. It was a body both feared and mistrusted, remembered for its centuries of rooting out heresy with fire and chains. Yet in this moment, it became something else. The only institution capable of peeling back the veil of secrecy around Sant'Ambrogio. Between 1859 and 1860, Judge Vincenzo Leone Salua would begin the painstaking work of uncovering the truth. At first, it seemed impossible that so much depravity could lurk behind convent walls. But as he began gathering testimony, the story that emerged was darker than Caterina herself had ever imagined. And at the heart of it all, there was not only sin, but politics, ambition, and a church hierarchy desperate to keep its most unholy secrets buried. When Princess Caterina's denunciation reached the Vatican, it carried a dangerous weight. To accuse a convent of poisoning, sexual corruption, and cultic worship was no small matter. If true, the scandal could ripple outward, shaking the very foundations of a church already navigating a precarious 19th-century world, where revolutions, nationalism, and anticlerical sentiment pressed hard against Rome's ancient walls. If false, dismissing it too quickly could offend a powerful dynasty and expose the papacy to ridicule. Thus, the case was entrusted to the Roman Inquisition, officially known as the Sanctum Officium. The irony was striking. In the public imagination, the Inquisition was synonymous with merciless torture chambers and the burning of heretics. Yet here in 1859, it would act less as an engine of cruelty and more as a tribunal of skeptical inquiry. Its mission was clear: sift fact from fever dream, separate personal vendetta from true corruption. The man appointed to lead this task was Judge Vincenzo Leone Salua, a sober and meticulous investigator. Salua was no wide-eyed novice. He had seen the tangled games of power and deceit within the church before. Still, even he could not have foreseen the labyrinth awaiting him inside Sant'Ambrogio. At first glance, the allegations appeared so extravagant: visions of Christ wielded as seductions, poisonings carried out with ground glass, forbidden sexual rites whispered of in cloisters, that Salua might have dismissed them as hysteria or exaggeration. But Caterina's testimony was not that of a peasant girl with little to lose. She was a Hohenzollern princess, and her words demanded attention. As Salua began questioning witnesses, he was quickly caught in a web of contradictions. Some spoke with trembling devotion of miraculous visions, while others hinted darkly at abuses too grotesque to speak of openly. The more he pressed, the clearer it became: the convent was not merely troubled. It was a stage on which faith had been twisted into theater, and where young women, bound by vows of obedience, became instruments in a drama orchestrated by those hungry for control. And always in the background loomed Pope Pius IX. The pontiff was no impartial bystander. His papacy was embroiled in battles for authority, with the doctrine of papal infallibility stirring in the air. The outcome of Salua's investigation would not simply determine the fate of a few cloistered women. It could either reinforce or destabilize the church's fragile moral authority at a time when it could least afford scandal. The judge's first discoveries pointed toward something far worse than a single attempted poisoning. He was about to peel back the veil on a legacy of corruption stretching decades into the past, rooted in the convent's very foundation. To understand Sant'Ambrogio's present horrors, Salua would first need to reckon with the ghostly figure who had shaped its past: Maria Agnes Ferrau, the so-called saint who had once reigned as its abbess. Long before Princess Caterina ever set foot inside Sant'Ambrogio, the convent already bore the scars of scandal. Its origins were bound to a woman whose name lingered like a haunting shadow: Maria Agnes Ferrau. To her followers, Ferrau was once a living saint, a mystic whose visions of Christ and healing powers promised divine favor. In the early decades of the 19th century, she was celebrated across Catholic Europe. Cardinals and bishops hung on her words. Even Pope Leo XII sought her spiritual guidance, convinced that her revelations carried the voice of heaven. Kings and queens sent petitions for her prayers, and nobles paraded her name as proof of Rome's enduring sanctity. But behind her aura of holiness, Ferrau's life told a darker story. The woman who proclaimed herself chosen by God was also weaving lies and indulgences into the fabric of her convent. She fabricated miracles, convincing both novices and seasoned clerics that she could heal the sick or see into the divine. More troubling still were the accusations of forbidden intimacy, her confessor himself entangled in a scandalous affair with her, and worse, novices pressured into sexual encounters under the guise of sacred ritual. The Inquisition had caught up with her in 1816. Ferrau was accused not only of fraudulent visions but of repeated sexual improprieties and, most damning of all, of undergoing abortions secretly arranged by clerical officials when her affairs resulted in pregnancies. These revelations shattered the carefully constructed image of a saintly abbess. The Vatican declared her a fraud, publicly condemned her, and stripped her of her position. And yet, power does not yield so easily. In 1829, Pope Leo XII, ironically one of her most devoted admirers, issued a papal brief that largely softened the earlier judgment. While she remained disgraced, she was never fully cast out. This half measure left behind a legacy of ambiguity, Was Ferrau a false saint or a misunderstood visionary? To the faithful within Sant'Ambrogio, she remained a spiritual presence, a figure whose memory could be venerated despite official condemnation. By the time Caterina entered the convent in the 1850s, Ferrau had been dead for years, yet her cult endured in whispers and in hidden devotions. Salua would later discover with dismay that many of the sisters still revered her as a saint, keeping her memory alive against the Church's decree. But Ferrau's ghost did more than inspire illicit prayers, it set the precedent. Her manipulation of young nuns and her invention of visions created the very template that others in the next generation would exploit. For if Ferrau was the convent's fallen matriarch, another woman had risen to fill her place. She was younger, more alluring, and even more dangerous. Her name was Maria Luisa. And unlike Ferrau, she was not content with whispers of sainthood. She wanted power, complete and unquestioned, and she would wield it with a terrifying mastery of faith, fear, and desire. By the late 1850s, the true center of gravity inside Sant'Ambrogio was not the abbess, nor the memory of Ferrau, it was Maria Luisa. Barely 27 years old, she was the convent's vicaress and novice mistress, and she carried herself with a charisma that could disarm even the most skeptical visitor. Those who encountered her often described her as radiant, with an intensity in her eyes that suggested divine favor. To the young women under her authority, she was not simply a superior, she was a living vessel of God's will. Maria Luisa claimed to experience visions of the Virgin Mary and Christ, visions that confirmed her authority and set her apart from the rest of the sisters. The abbess herself deferred to these supposed revelations, treating her not just as a subordinate but as a chosen intermediary. This, more than official titles, gave Maria Luisa her power, the aura of sanctity, impossible to challenge without appearing to defy God himself. But Maria Luisa was not content with mere reverence. Like Ferrau before her, she exploited her visions to manipulate the community around her. Unlike Ferrau, however, Maria Luisa was young, beautiful, and ambitious. She moved through the convent with the air of someone destined for sainthood, weaving herself into the spiritual imaginations of the novices, who were desperate for guidance and fearful of failing their vows. Her methods were subtler, more psychological than Ferrau's. She did not only demand devotion, she demanded intimacy. Salua's investigation would later reveal that Maria Luisa saw herself as Ferrau's successor, but also her rival. Where Ferrau had left behind a tainted legacy, Maria Luisa sought to outshine it with her own mythology. She claimed that Christ himself appeared to her in ecstasies, commanding her to lead the convent, to heal the sick, to guide novices into spiritual purity. Yet what she truly offered them was not purity, but corruption draped in the language of divine love. To many of the sisters, these contradictions did not appear as contradictions at all. In a cloistered world where obedience was sacred and spiritual experiences were both coveted and feared, Maria Luisa's claims felt plausible. Visions and miracles were woven deeply into Catholic devotion. Who was to say she had not been chosen? And for those who doubted, fear silenced them. Maria Luisa had already shown that she was not merely a mystic, she was ruthless. Opposition to her authority could mean exile, or worse. By the time Caterina entered Sant'Ambrogio, Maria Luisa's influence had reached its peak. She was no longer just a figure of admiration, she was the axis upon which the convent turned. And for a vulnerable princess seeking peace, it would not take long to sense that behind the saintly mask of this young woman, something monstrous was waiting to be revealed. It was in the secretive hush of Sant'Ambrogio's cloisters that Maria Luisa's power revealed its most disturbing form. Cloaked in the language of visions and divine revelation, she transformed her private desires into sacred commands. The novices, young women barely entering adulthood, often from families eager to see them cloistered, were both impressionable and vulnerable. To them, Maria Luisa was more than a superior, she was a mediator between their souls and heaven. And when she spoke, she claimed it was not her voice but Christ's. The testimonies Judge Salua collected were harrowing. One sister recounted how Maria Luisa explained that God had shown her a vision, that the novice was afflicted with a hidden illness, one that could only be healed through intimate contact. Another recalled that Maria Luisa described a divine liquid flowing from the Lord, collecting in her own body, a mystical substance that must be shared. The words on paper seem grotesque, but in the isolation of the convent, framed as sacred, they became commands impossible to refuse. For the novices, disobedience was unthinkable. If God truly spoke through Maria Luisa, then to resist her advances would be to resist Christ himself. And so, these encounters took on the structure of ritual. Maria Luisa created what she called giving, acts in which novices were told to position themselves in ways that allowed her body to entwine with theirs. She pressed her mouth against theirs, instructing them that the exchange was not lust but grace. She demanded that they lie breast to breast, or take turns mounting one another, insisting that the fluids exchanged were divine gifts of healing. These were not isolated acts. Maria Luisa institutionalized them as rites of passage. Before a novice could take her final vows and fully become a nun, she was required to spend a night with the vicaress. That night, Maria Luisa declared, was sacred, an initiation where the novice would experience a mystical union that prepared her for her vows. Even more chilling, Maria Luisa often framed her behavior in continuity with Ferreos. In her confessions to Salua, she admitted that she too had once been a victim. Ferrao herself had performed similar acts upon her when she was a novice. What she had suffered, she repeated upon others, sanctifying abuse as tradition cloaked in the language of faith. For the Inquisition, these testimonies were damning. They revealed not only the grotesque misuse of spiritual authority, but the ways in which the convent had become an echo chamber of abuse, each generation perpetuating the sins of the last. Behind the chants of prayer and the whispers of rosaries, Sant'Ambrogio hid a theater where visions became excuses, intimacy became coercion, and the line between holiness and horror dissolved completely. Yet as twisted as these revelations were, they were only the beginning. Maria Luisa's grip on the convent did not rest solely on seduction. When persuasion failed, she was willing to employ something far more final: poison. For Princess Caterina, the charm of Maria Luisa had quickly soured. At first, she had tried to accept the vicaress's reputation for visions, even humored the idea that God might speak through her. But Caterina was not a naive novice. She was a worldly woman, hardened by loss, illness, and the politics of European courts. What she saw at Sant'Ambrogio disturbed her. The rituals, the forced intimacy, the veneration of a woman condemned as a false saint, all of it reeked of deception. Worse, Caterina's health began to fail in ways that could not be explained by her already fragile constitution. Meals were prepared for her with unusual care, often under Maria Luisa's supervision. One day she was served a simple bowl of gruel, unremarkable at first glance, but within it lurked a deadly mixture: ground glass, tartar emetic, and opium. The concoction was cruelly calculated. Ground glass would shred her stomach lining, tartar emetic would induce violent vomiting, and opium would sedate her into silence. Caterina ate. Soon after, the torment began. Her body convulsed with waves of nausea. She vomited blood, her abdomen racked with searing pain. In her excrement, she later claimed, she passed fragments that looked like strips of her own stomach lining. Death hovered close, but she did not succumb. Her bulk, once mocked in whispers, may have saved her. The poison weakened her, but it did not end her. For Maria Luisa, failure demanded escalation. If the princess would not die, then others who knew too much would. Salua's investigation revealed that Maria Luisa turned her poison not only on Caterina, but on her own accomplices when they threatened to waver in loyalty. One young nun, barely 21, died suddenly after speaking against her. Another, only 22, fell just as swiftly. An older sister, respected but cautious, was also eliminated. Each death was cloaked in pious explanations: illnesses, mysterious fevers, the natural frailty of cloistered life. But the truth was darker. Maria Luisa wielded poison as a tool of silence, ensuring that fear and obedience bound the convent as tightly as its walls. Not all perished. A few survived, those who were exiled rather than killed, dismissed from the convent under pretense of discipline. These exiles, however, became Salua's key witnesses, testifying to what they had endured and what they had seen Maria Luisa inflict upon others. Their words painted a portrait of a woman who ruled the convent not as a spiritual guide, but as a tyrant cloaked in sanctity. For Caterina, survival brought clarity. She now understood that Sant'Ambrogio was not a place of refuge, but a nest of serpents. And if she wished to escape with her life, she would need allies beyond its walls. Her denunciation to the Inquisition was not merely an act of courage, it was an act of desperation, a bid to save herself and others from the grip of a woman who would rather kill than be exposed. The deeper Judge Salua probed, the more the convent revealed itself as a place suspended between terror and devotion. Maria Luisa's victims were not only those she poisoned or coerced. Many of the sisters lived in a liminal state of fear, reverence, and complicity. To some, she was a tyrant whose word could spell exile or death. To others, she was a saint whose visions proved her chosen by heaven. The truth was that she was both, and that duality was the source of her strength. The convent's youngest members bore the heaviest burden. These novices, sent by their families to dedicate their lives to God, found themselves trapped in a world where their faith was weaponized against them. Maria Luisa could demand silence as an act of obedience. She could frame intimacy as holy, poison as divine punishment, and loyalty as proof of salvation. To resist her was to risk not only earthly suffering but eternal damnation. For impressionable souls, the threat was paralyzing. Those who perished at her hands did so quietly. Their deaths were absorbed into the rhythms of cloistered life, explained away as illnesses or God's will. And those who survived often carried wounds far deeper than the body, trauma bound tightly by vows of secrecy and shame. When Salua interviewed them years later, their testimonies came haltingly, as though even the act of speaking might bring retribution from beyond the grave. Yet perhaps most chilling of all was the loyalty Maria Luisa commanded from some of the sisters. Even as poisonings were whispered about, even as rituals of seduction became known, there were nuns who defended her to the last. To them, she was a victim of misunderstanding, a saint persecuted as Christ himself had been persecuted. In their eyes, Caterina's accusations were slander, a foreign princess's hysteria dressed up as truth. It was this strange web, half cult, half community, that made Sant'Ambrogio so dangerous. A convent was supposed to be a fortress of prayer, sealed from the corruption of the outside world. Instead, it had become a place where the very structures of devotion, obedience, faith, and silence were twisted into chains that bound the innocent to their abuser. For Salua, unraveling this web meant more than cataloging crimes. It meant confronting the unsettling reality that the convent was not an isolated aberration. It was part of a wider storm gathering within the church itself. And as the judge soon discovered, the rot inside Sant'Ambrogio was entangled with theological battles that stretched far beyond its walls. As Salua sifted through testimony, it became clear that Sant'Ambrogio was more than just a convent in crisis. It was a mirror reflecting the wider fractures of the Catholic Church in the mid-19th century. Europe was a continent in upheaval. The Napoleonic Wars had shattered old certainties, revolutions simmered in the streets, and the very authority of Rome was under siege from rising nationalism and secular governments. In this crucible, theology was no mere abstraction. It was politics clothed in the language of God. At the heart of the conflict lay a single question: how absolute was the authority of the Pope? For centuries, popes had wielded immense spiritual influence, but now, with empires collapsing and modern states asserting themselves, a faction within the Church pushed for something even more radical: the formal declaration of papal infallibility. If defined as dogma, it would mean that the Pope's teachings on faith and morals, when pronounced ex cathedra, could never be in error. For ultramontane Catholics, those who looked beyond the mountains to Rome for authority, this doctrine was salvation, a shield against the chaos of modernity. But not all agreed. Powerful cardinals, bishops, and theologians resisted, fearing that such absolutism would fracture the Church further and alienate nations already suspicious of papal power. And it was into this storm that the scandal of Sant'Ambrogio erupted. Maria Luisa's visions, her so-called miracles, and the cults surrounding both her and Ferrau were not merely matters of cloister gossip. They were threads woven into the theological wars of the Curia. Many of her defenders, and even her confessors, belonged to the ultramontane faction. They saw in her mystical authority a convenient tool, a way to reinforce their vision of an unassailable papacy. Her supposed ecstasies could be used to silence critics, expose rivals, and strengthen the myth that God himself spoke through those aligned with Rome. On the other side stood Princess Caterina's cousin, Archbishop Hohenlohe Schillingfürst, a prominent opponent of ultramontanism. To him, Sant'Ambrogio was not just a scandalous convent, it was proof of the dangers of blind devotion and unchecked papal power. His role in rescuing Caterina was as much political as personal. By exposing the corruption inside Sant'Ambrogio, he aimed to strike at the heart of the ultramontane cause. Thus, the convent's horrors became ammunition in a larger battle. What might have been dismissed as the sins of a few cloistered women was now entangled with the fate of the papacy itself. Every testimony Salua recorded, every revelation of poison or seduction, threatened to ripple outward, destabilizing the theological foundations upon which Pius IX sought to build his authority. In this sense, the scandal was not an isolated eruption of depravity, it was a battlefield where power, faith, and survival collided. And as Salua pressed further, he realized the most dangerous players were not the nuns, but the confessors who guided them. Men whose names carried weight far beyond convent walls. men whose fall could shake Rome to its core. As Judge Salua pressed deeper, the focus of his inquiry shifted. The nuns' confessions revealed not only the predatory power of Maria Luisa, but also the invisible hands guiding and enabling her from the shadows, the confessors. In any convent, the confessor was a figure of immense influence, a man who heard the most private thoughts of cloistered women, who absolved their sins, and who shaped their understanding of God's will. At Sant'Ambrogio, that sacred duty had been corrupted into a mechanism of control. Two names emerged again and again in the testimonies: Giuseppe Lazzaroli and Giuseppe Peters. Both were Jesuits, and both, according to witnesses, had played roles in sustaining the atmosphere of fear and devotion around Maria Luisa. The allegations were grave, that they had broken the seal of confession, revealing sacred secrets to manipulate the sisters, that they had encouraged the continued veneration of Ferrau, even after her condemnation, and that they had defended Maria Luisa despite growing evidence of her abuses. Lazzaroli, the first of the two, appeared almost pitiful in his complicity. He had clung to the memory of Ferrau, stubbornly venerating her as a saint in defiance of the Inquisition's verdict. To him, perhaps, the line between faith and delusion had blurred beyond recognition. But the second, Giuseppe Peters, was far more dangerous. Salua soon uncovered that Peters was not Peters at all. His true identity sent shockwaves through the investigation. He was Joseph Kleutgen, a name that carried immense weight in the halls of Rome. A German Jesuit, Kleutgen was one of the leading theologians of his age, the intellectual architect of the very movement pushing for papal infallibility. His writings shaped seminaries, influenced cardinals, and even touched the desk of Pope Pius IX himself. The revelation was staggering. Here was not some obscure priest caught in a convent scandal. This was a man whose pen was carving the future of Catholic doctrine. To expose him as complicit in sexual corruption, manipulation, and heresy was to risk undermining not only a single faction, but the intellectual scaffolding of the papacy's authority. For Salua, the stakes could not have been higher. The case was no longer about Maria Luisa's twisted visions or Caterina's survival. It was about whether one of the Church's most revered theologians, one of the very men charged with defending its purity, was himself entangled in the darkest scandal of the age. The mask had been lifted. The question now was not whether Kleutgen was guilty, but how far his double life reached, and how deeply the Church itself was prepared to bury the truth. Joseph Kleutgen was no ordinary priest. To many in Rome, he was the beating heart of Catholic intellectual revival. A scholar of rare brilliance, he sought to restore the authority of medieval theology, particularly that of Thomas Aquinas, at a time when modern philosophy threatened to erode the foundations of faith. His writings, dense and rigorous, helped forge what would become known as neo-scholasticism. In seminaries across Europe, his works were studied as the blueprint for Catholic renewal. Cardinals cited him, bishops defended him, and the Jesuit superior general himself relied on his insights. Yet in the cloistered halls of Sant'Ambrogio, Kleutgen lived another life. Behind the alias of Peters, he was not the defender of purity but the confessor entangled in Maria Luisa's deceptions. She herself confessed to Salua that she and Kleutgen shared not only spiritual intimacy but a full sexual affair. The revelation was scandalous enough, but more shocking still was Kleutgen's justification. When pressed, he claimed that their union was not driven by lust, but by a higher, holier purpose. Sex without lust, he argued, was no sin. It was an astonishing rationalization, one that revealed how far even a great mind could twist theology to serve desire. For Salua, this was a devastating irony. Kleutgen, the man shaping doctrines meant to reinforce papal authority, was simultaneously undermining that authority with his own conduct. His double life was not merely personal hypocrisy, it was a fracture in the very intellectual edifice upon which Pius IX hoped to build the modern Church. Nor was Kleutgen's fall from grace limited to private sin. His involvement with Maria Luisa meant that he had abetted her manipulation of the nuns, supported her false visions, and used the confessional to bind sisters in obedience to her. In one of the most damning twists, Maria Luisa admitted that Kleutgen had encouraged her to employ her visions strategically, to expose enemies, to silence critics, and to consolidate her power within the convent. And yet, Kleutgen remained shielded by his reputation. Few outside the Inquisition knew the truth of his actions, and fewer still would have believed it. To the wider Church, he was still the brilliant theologian whose pen gave voice to the ultramontane cause. To the novices of Sant'Ambrogio, he was the confessor who betrayed them. This was the paradox Salua now faced. How could justice be done when the guilty man's influence reached the very heart of the papacy? To condemn Kleutgen publicly would mean exposing not just his crimes, but the fragility of the Church itself at a moment when enemies circled from all sides. To conceal his guilt, however, would mean abandoning the truth and the victims to the shadows. The scandal of Sant'Ambrogio had now become more than a convent's nightmare. It had become a crucible in which the moral authority of the Catholic Church would be tested. For Maria Luisa and Joseph Kleutgen, desire was never enough. Their alliance was more than a matter of intimacy, it was political. They understood that visions could be weaponized, that divine ecstasies could serve as tools to advance their cause and eliminate rivals. Inside Sant'Ambrogio, this meant silencing dissenting sisters. But beyond its walls, it meant influencing the larger struggles within the Jesuit order and the Curia itself. Testimony revealed that Maria Luisa's revelations often seemed uncannily convenient. At times, her visions exposed alleged sins or weaknesses of rival clerics, men who happened to stand in opposition to the ultramontane faction Kleutgen belonged to. In one instance, she declared that God had revealed to her the secret homosexual relationship of two Jesuit theologians, both adversaries of Kleutgen. Such accusations, coming from a woman believed to be a vessel of Christ's voice, carried enormous weight. They could end reputations, dismantle alliances, and tilt the balance of power within the order. Behind the pious theater of her ecstasies, there was calculation. Maria Luisa played the role of mystic, Kleutgen supplied the strategy. He understood the climate of Rome, the stakes of theological war, and the hunger for divine confirmation of political agendas. Together, they exploited the credulity of those who desperately wanted miracles to validate their cause. But their betrayals cut deeper still. For the novices who trusted Maria Luisa, her visions were sacred, binding them to obedience and silence. When she whispered that God had chosen them for intimacy, they submitted not to lust but to what they believed was heaven's demand. When she claimed that Christ commanded her to protect the convent from enemies, they followed her in blind loyalty, even as suspicion and death spread around them. Betrayal was stitched into the very fabric of their daily prayers. And yet, perhaps the greatest betrayal was that of Joseph Kleutgen himself. Here was a man entrusted with the souls of the faithful, a confessor meant to guide with honesty and humility. Instead, he encouraged Maria Luisa's deceptions, benefited from her manipulations, and used her as a weapon in his own political battles. In doing so, he betrayed not only the women under his care, but the very church whose purity he claimed to defend. The scandal was no longer about the sins of a convent. It was about how visions and miracles, supposed gifts of God, were being turned into instruments of intrigue. And as Salua compiled his findings, the implications became terrifyingly clear. Sant'Ambrogio was not an isolated corruption. It was a symptom of a wider sickness, one that infected the very heart of the Church. The revelations pouring from Sant'Ambrogio were more than sordid details of convent life. They threatened to shake the intellectual and spiritual scaffolding of the Catholic Church itself. For decades, Rome had been preparing for a doctrinal confrontation with modernity. Liberal revolutions, secular governments, and new philosophies were all gnawing at the authority of the papacy. To counter this, the ultramontane faction, supported by theologians like Joseph Kleutgen, sought to consolidate the Pope's power in unprecedented ways. Central to their project was the idea of papal infallibility, the notion that when the Pope spoke definitively on matters of faith and morals, he could not err. It was an audacious claim, one meant to place the papacy above the shifting sands of politics and philosophy. Kleutgen was a leading voice in this movement, his writings providing the theological backbone for the doctrine. And yet, as Judge Salua uncovered, the very man buttressing papal authority with his pen was simultaneously dismantling it with his actions. This was no mere personal failing. It struck at the heart of the ultramontane argument. If the defenders of infallibility could be so fallible, so corrupt, then how could the doctrine stand unshaken? To Caterina's cousin, Archbishop Hohenlohe Schillingfürst, a fierce critic of ultramontanism, the scandal was providence. It exposed, in flesh and blood, the dangers of blind obedience to a church that demanded submission even when its leaders were compromised. But for Pope Pius IX and his allies, the scandal was a nightmare. Pius was already embattled, stripped of political territories, desperate to preserve what remained of papal sovereignty. His vision of a centralized, unchallengeable papacy depended on the credibility of men like Kleutgen. To admit his guilt too openly would not only condemn a theologian, it would undermine the entire intellectual foundation of Pius's reign. Thus, Sant'Ambrogio became more than a convent scandal, it became a theological earthquake. Every deposition Salua recorded, Every revelation of poison, seduction, or manipulation threatened to ripple outward, destabilizing debates that would soon culminate in the First Vatican Council of 1869-70. The very walls of the convent seemed to echo with irony. A cloister built for prayer and obedience had become the stage upon which the future of the Church was tested. And still the storm was not over. As Salua pressed on, the question was no longer whether the nuns and their confessors were guilty, but whether Rome itself had the courage to punish them, or whether politics would bury justice beneath the weight of necessity. When Judge Salua concluded his meticulous investigation, the evidence was overwhelming. Maria Luisa had been exposed as a fraud, a manipulator, and a murderer. Her crimes were not limited to spiritual corruption. There were bodies buried in the convent's history, novices broken by coercion, and a princess nearly killed by poison. By any secular standard of justice, her fate should have been sealed. A woman guilty of such atrocities might have faced execution, or at the very least life imprisonment. Joseph Kleutgen's guilt, too, was undeniable. He had not only engaged in a sexual relationship with Maria Luisa but had also abused his sacred position as confessor, encouraging her false visions and benefiting from her influence. His theological brilliance could not wash away the reality of his complicity. In another society, his disgrace might have ended in exile or imprisonment. And yet, when the sentences were finally handed down, the results revealed the full weight of politics pressing against the scales of justice. Maria Luisa was sentenced to 20 years of confinement, not in a prison but in a convent. Even that punishment was softened by Pope Pius IX himself, who reduced it to 18 years. She would spend her sentence cloistered, not in chains, shielded from the eyes of the public who might have demanded her death. Kleutgen's case was even more striking. Initially condemned to 3 years of monastic imprisonment, his sentence was reduced to 2. He was sent not to a dank cell but to a retreat house on the serene shores of Lake Nemi, where the punishment resembled more a forced sabbatical than true incarceration. One cardinal had even argued that he should receive no punishment at all, insisting that his theological importance outweighed his personal sins. For Salua it was a bitter irony. He had carried out his duty with rigor, exposing the corruption festering inside Sant'Ambrogio, only to watch justice unravel at the highest levels. The Inquisition, so often reviled for its severity, had here demanded accountability. But the Pope, fearing the damage such accountability might inflict on the fragile authority of the Church, chose leniency. To the outside world the scandal never erupted as it might have. There were whispers, rumors, and scattered accounts, but the machinery of Rome worked tirelessly to suppress the story. The Church's image had to be preserved. Maria Luisa and Kleutgen were quietly tucked away, their sentences a pale reflection of their crimes. And so the official trial ended. But beneath its silence lingered questions that refused to be buried. Why had the Church chosen mercy for the guilty over justice for the dead? And what did this leniency reveal about the priorities of an institution fighting for survival in an age of doubt? The scandal of Sant'Ambrogio did not end with the sentencing, it ended with the silencing. Pope Pius IX, faced with the choice between transparency and control, chose control. His decision to commute sentences and shield Kleutgen and Maria Luisa from harsher punishment was not born of compassion for individuals but of calculation for the institution. The Church, already battered by political losses and rising tides of nationalism, could not afford to display weakness. To admit fully to the horrors within Sant'Ambrogio would have been to hand ammunition to its enemies. The irony was heavy. The Roman Inquisition, long infamous for its merciless zeal, had in this instance been the most rigorous seeker of truth. Salua and his fellow judges had gathered damning evidence with a skeptical discipline that bordered on modern investigation. Yet their work was undone not by error or lack of proof, but by the papacy's determination to protect its own. For Pope Pius IX, the scandal struck at the heart of his ultramontane project. He relied on theologians like Kleutgen to defend papal supremacy and prepare the way for the declaration of papal infallibility. To let Kleutgen fall too far would weaken the intellectual foundation of his cause. Maria Luisa, too, was tied by threads of loyalty to clerics whose support he could not risk losing. Better, then, to portray them as misguided souls, chastened by mild sentences, than as criminals deserving true punishment. This was not the first time the Church had chosen politics over justice, nor would it be the last. In protecting its image, it abandoned the vulnerable. The novices manipulated, the nuns poisoned, the faith of countless believers betrayed. In burying the scandal, it allowed the illusion of sanctity to triumph over the reality of corruption. Yet Pius IX's leniency carried its own hidden dangers. Every commuted sentence, every hushed testimony, deepened the cynicism of those who already doubted the papacy's claims to moral authority. Among critics of ultramontanism, the scandal became proof of what they feared most, that absolute power corrupted absolutely, and that Rome would sacrifice truth in order to preserve control. For the faithful who remained unaware, the illusion of purity survived. But for those who glimpsed behind the veil, the question lingered like a wound. If even the holiest institutions chose protection of power over the pursuit of justice, what faith could be left unshaken? In the aftermath of the trial, the Vatican moved swiftly to erase the stain of Sant'Ambrogio from living memory. Official records were tucked away, testimonies sealed, and the scandal spoken of only in whispers. The machinery of silence was deliberate. For the Church, history itself could be managed, rewritten, or simply left to decay in forgotten archives. The Jesuits, ever protective of their intellectual champions, worked especially hard to safeguard Kleutgen's reputation. In subsequent histories of the order, his name would be celebrated as a pillar of neo-scholasticism, the father of a movement that fortified Catholic thought against modern philosophy. His role in shaping the very arguments for papal infallibility was lauded. His crimes at Sant'Ambrogio, however, were carefully omitted. To acknowledge them would have been to admit that the intellectual cornerstone of ultramontanism was cracked from within. Even Maria Luisa, though condemned to cloistered confinement, faded into obscurity rather than infamy. Her story was not retold as a warning, nor her victims remembered as martyrs. Instead, she became a ghost in the margins of history, her name mentioned only when necessary, stripped of the context that revealed her monstrosity. The young women she manipulated, the sisters she poisoned, the princess she nearly killed, all of them were swallowed by silence. This deliberate forgetting was, in its own way, more powerful than any punishment. Scandal thrives in the public eye, but when denied oxygen, it becomes a rumor, a shadow, a footnote. By downplaying Sant'Ambrogio, by suppressing Salua's findings, the Church ensured that the scandal never reached the level of the great ecclesiastical crises of the age. It was contained, buried, and nearly lost. Yet the erasure carried a bitter irony. The very act of rewriting Kleutgen's legacy into that of a saintly scholar underscored the fragility of truth. For those who stumbled upon fragments of the case, the contrast was jarring. The celebrated theologian who had shaped Catholic doctrine was also the confessor who exploited women in the secrecy of a convent. The contradiction was too dangerous to reconcile, so it was hidden instead. Generations later, when historians would finally unearth the full scope of the Sant'Ambrogio scandal, they would marvel less at the crimes themselves than at the thoroughness with which they had been forgotten. It was not simply a convent's sin, but an institution's decision that silence was safer than memory. Perhaps the greatest irony of the Sant'Ambrogio affair was the role of the Roman Inquisition. For centuries, it had been synonymous with cruelty, a tribunal that silenced heresy with fire, chains, and fear. Its very name evoked images of dark chambers, confessions wrenched by torture, and unyielding dogma. And yet, in the case of Sant'Ambrogio, it was the Inquisition, not the papacy, that became the unexpected guardian of reason. Judge Salua and his colleagues approached their work with a skepticism that would not have been out of place in a secular court. They demanded evidence, corroboration, detail. Where others might have dismissed Caterina's accusations as the hysteria of a sickly woman, Salua followed the threads patiently, uncovering a picture far darker than even the princess imagined. Where confessors broke their vows and popes bent the truth, the Inquisition insisted on documentation, testimony, and clarity. It is not that the Inquisition was suddenly enlightened. Its motives were rooted in the same defense of orthodoxy that had long defined it. But in this case, orthodoxy demanded exposure. False saints, fabricated visions, and corrupted confessors were as much threats to the purity of Catholic faith as heretical books or Protestant sermons. By pulling apart the tangled lies of Sant'Ambrogio, the Inquisition believed it was defending the Church from within. And so, history gave us a paradox. The very institution remembered for its blind zeal acted here as a voice of critical reason, while the papacy, so often associated with mercy and pastoral care, became the enabler of silence and compromise. For modern readers, the reversal is startling. The inquisitors sought truth with rigor, while the Pope sought preservation through concealment. The irony did not escape contemporaries either. Among the Church's critics, it became a point of bitter humor, that the dreaded Inquisition was now the honest judge, while the shepherd of Christ's flock turned a blind eye. To those who had suffered in silence within Sant'Ambrogio, it was a cruel reminder that justice, when it finally came from the most unlikely of places. In the end, the Inquisition's devotion to uncovering the truth of Sant'Ambrogio was real, but powerless. Their findings were buried, their sentences softened, their work overshadowed by papal politics. The inquisitors may have acted like modern investigators, but their power ended at the Pope's desk. And when Pius IX chose leniency, their rigor dissolved into obscurity. The stage was thus set for the final irony, that history itself, like the convent's cloistered halls, could be manipulated. That the truth could be uncovered with painstaking care, only to be hidden again not by lies but by silence. The scandal of Sant'Ambrogio did not thunder across Europe like the great political upheavals of its age. It did not topple kings or split nations. Instead, it whispered, first in testimonies sealed within the Inquisition's archives, then in fragments buried in forgotten histories. Yet in its silence, it revealed truths as devastating as any battlefield defeat. What Sant'Ambrogio laid bare was the fragility of institutions built upon the appearance of sanctity. A convent meant to embody purity had become a stage for manipulation and murder. A confessor meant to guard the souls of women had exploited their faith. A pope meant to be shepherd had chosen preservation of power over justice for the vulnerable. And all of it was hidden not because it was too obscure but because it was too revealing. The victims of Sant'Ambrogio, those novices silenced by fear, those sisters poisoned for disobedience, even Princess Caterina herself, were casualties of an institution unwilling to confront its own corruption. Their suffering was not commemorated, their names not sanctified. They became ghosts in the Church's memory, erased so that the illusion of holiness could endure. And yet the story survives. It survives in the documents Judge Salua so carefully compiled, in the testimonies of women who dared to break silence, and in the uncomfortable irony that the Roman Inquisition, the very symbol of oppression, stood closer to justice than the papacy it served. It survives as a cautionary tale, a reminder that devotion can be twisted, that visions can be exploited, and that even the holiest of walls may conceal unholy secrets. The scandal's legacy also lives in its timing. Just a decade later, in 1870, the First Vatican Council declared papal infallibility as dogma, a triumph for the ultramontane vision Kleutgen himself had helped shape. The irony is haunting. One of the doctrine's great architects was the same man whose double life had nearly unraveled the sanctity of the Church from within. His sins were forgotten, his theology canonized. History often remembers the grand gestures, the proclamations, the councils, the sweeping reforms. But sometimes it is the forgotten scandals, hidden in shadows, that speak most loudly. Sant'Ambrogio reminds us that the danger is not only in the sins themselves, but in their burial. For what is erased from memory can never be reckoned with, and what is never reckoned with will return, again and again, in new forms. The convent of Sant'Ambrogio still stands in Rome today, its stones bearing no outward trace of the turmoil once housed within. To pass it on a quiet street is to see only walls, blank, unassuming, silent. Yet behind those walls, a century and a half ago, visions became weapons, desire became ritual, and justice was swallowed by silence. And that silence, more than anything, is the true legacy of Sant'Ambrogio.